Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a throne on Terra. It sits in the deepest vaults beneath a palace so vast that it covers entire continents. A structure so immense that whole generations of workers have lived and died within its corridors without ever seeing the sun. The throne itself is ancient beyond reckoning, built from technology that no living mind fully understands, powered by mechanisms that blur the line between science and something far older, far stranger. And upon that throne, locked in an eternal prison of failing machinery and fading flesh, sits the single most important being in the entire galaxy. He has had many names across the long millennia: the master of mankind, the anathema, the god emperor, the corpse emperor, Revelation. But before all those titles, before the golden armor and the flaming sword, before the legions and the crusades and the betrayals that shattered everything he built, he was simply a man, or at least something that looked like one. This is his story, and it is, without any exaggeration, the story upon which the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe rests. Every faction, every war, every screaming charge across a blood-soaked battlefield, every whispered prayer in a candlelit cathedral on some forgotten world at the edge of known space, all of it traces back to him. To his ambitions, his failures, his sacrifices, and the terrible price he continues to pay 10,000 years after the moment that should have been his death. He is the reason the Imperium exists. He is the reason it has not yet fallen. And he may also be the reason it has become the very thing he fought against. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you through the full, unabridged tale of the Emperor of Mankind, from his mysterious origins in the deep past of human prehistory, through his millennia of hidden influence, his rise to open power, his grand vision for the future of the species, and the devastating catastrophe that left him trapped between life and death on a machine that is slowly, irreversibly failing. This is not a short story. This is a story that spans tens of thousands of years, and it touches on every corner of the 40,000 setting. There is no understanding Warhammer without understanding the Emperor. He is the foundation, the keystone, the load-bearing pillar that holds the entire grim darkness of the far future in place. Let us start at the very beginning, and the beginning, as it turns out, it is shrouded in more mystery and contradiction than perhaps any other event in the lore. Because the Emperor did not simply appear one day, fully formed and ready to conquer the galaxy. His origins reach back into the deep past of human civilization, into an age so distant that even the Imperium's most dedicated historians can do little more than speculate. The records have been lost, rewritten, mythologized, and manipulated so many times that separating truth from legend is an act more of faith than scholarship. And perhaps that is fitting, given everything that would follow. What we do know, or what the most widely accepted accounts suggest, is that the being who would become the Emperor was born sometime around the 8th millennium, before the Common Era. That is roughly 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, or for those keeping track, which places his origins firmly in the Neolithic period of human development. The world he was born into was one of small agricultural settlements and early cities, of stone tools giving way to copper, of humanity taking its first uncertain steps towards civilization. And it was into this world, specifically into a region that we would now call Central Anatolia, in what is modern-day Turkey, that the most powerful psyker in human history drew his first breath. The circumstances of that birth are themselves the subject of intense debate and multiple contradictory accounts. The oldest version of the story, the one that has persisted in various forms since the earliest days of the lore, involves the shamans. These were not shamans in the simple primitive sense that the word might conjure, and they were the wisest and most powerful of living humans at that time, beings who had mastered the earliest forms of what would later be called psychic power. They were connected to the warp, that parallel dimension of raw psychic energy that underlies all of physical reality. And through that connection, they possessed abilities that set them apart from ordinary humanity. They could heal the sick, see fragments of the future, and most importantly, they had learned the secret of reincarnation. When a shaman died, their soul would pass into the warp and eventually return, reborn into a new body with their accumulated knowledge and power intact. But something was changing. The warp, which had once been a relatively calm sea of psychic energy, was growing darker. Predatory entities were forming within its depths, coalescing out of the emotional resonance of every thinking being in the galaxy. These entities, the beings that would eventually become the Chaos Gods, were growing hungry. They had discovered that the souls of the shamans were particularly nourishing, rich with accumulated psychic power from countless lifetimes of reincarnation. And so the shamans found themselves under siege, where once their souls had passed safely through the warp to be reborn. Now those same souls were being hunted, devoured by the growing darkness before they could complete the cycle of rebirth. The shamans were dying, truly dying, and with them would go humanity's last line of defense against the predatory forces of the immaterial realm. Faced with this existential threat, the shamans devised a plan that was as desperate as it was audacious. They would pool their power, combine their souls into a single vessel so potent that no predator in the warp could consume it. They would create a being of such overwhelming psychic might that it could stand against the darkness and protect humanity for all the ages to come. And so, in an act of collective self-sacrifice that has no parallel in human history, thousands of shamans took their own lives simultaneously. Their souls rushed into the warp together, merging, combining, fusing into something entirely new, something that had never existed before and would never exist again. The new man. 1 year later, according to the account, a child was born to a family of Anatolian farmers, a child who carried within him the combined souls and accumulated wisdom of thousands of the most powerful humans who had ever lived, a child whose eyes held the weight of millennia, whose mind already crackled with psychic potential that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. He looked human. He was born of human parents. He cried and breathed and ate and grew like any other child. But he was something more, something fundamentally, irrevocably different from every other being on the planet. Now, it is important to note that this origin story, as compelling and widely known as it is, represents only one version of events. The lore of Warhammer 40k is deliberately constructed so that no single account of the Emperor's origins is definitively confirmed as the absolute truth. Some sources suggest that the Emperor was not created by the shamans at all, but was simply born as a natural mutation, at the first and most extreme expression of humanity's latent psychic potential emerging spontaneously. Others hint at something darker and more unsettling, that the Emperor might be a weapon, a bioengineered construct left over from the dark age of technology, humanity's lost golden age of scientific advancement. There is a quote from a character named Koja Ju in the novel Master of Mankind that captures this alternative theory with chilling directness. She describes him as a relic left over from the Dark Age, a weapon left out of its box, now running rampant. And then there is the matter of the perpetuals. The Emperor was not the only immortal walking the earth in those ancient days. He was part of a broader group of beings known as perpetuals, and a mutant branch of humanity gifted with effective immortality through extremely rapid and efficient cellular regeneration. These perpetuals could recover from virtually any injury, up to and including death itself. They could be killed, yes, but their bodies would reconstitute, their consciousness would return, and they would rise again. Some perpetuals had unique abilities beyond mere immortality. Some could teleport across vast distances. Others possessed exceptional strength or speed or psychic sensitivity. But all of them shared that core trait, the inability to truly die by conventional means. The emperor was the most powerful of the perpetuals by an enormous margin, but he was not alone. He walked among others of his kind, and his relationships with these fellow immortals would have profound consequences across the millennia. There was Olivia Sureka, who would later be entrusted with guarding a gateway to the warp on a distant world. There was Alanius Person, who in some accounts served as the emperor's war master in the ancient world, long before the title would be given to a very different individual with far more tragic results. There was Erda, who would become deeply intertwined with the emperor's most ambitious project, the creation of the Primarchs, and whose actions may have inadvertently set in motion the greatest catastrophe in human history. And there was Malcador, the Sigillite, whose loyalty to the emperor would endure across millennia, and whose sacrifice at the end would be one of the most poignant moments in the entire saga. But all of that lay in the distant future. In the beginning, there was simply a child growing up on the banks of the Sakarya River in prehistoric Anatolia, learning the contours of a world that he would one day reshape in ways that no one could possibly imagine. The first recorded event in the emperor's life, the first moment where we see a hint of what he would become, involves a murder. His father was killed by his own uncle, an act of familial violence that was tragically common in the brutal world of Neolithic Anatolia. The boy who would become the emperor found his father's body. He prepared it for burial in the manner of his people, plastering the skull with clay and placing shells over the empty eye sockets, a funerary practice that archaeologists have found evidence of across the Neolithic Levant and Anatolia. Yes, it was while performing this ritual that the boy experienced something that no one else in his village could have understood. He saw the murder, not as a deduction or a guess, but as a psychic vision, a clear and undeniable window into the past that showed him exactly what had happened and who was responsible. What followed was cold and deliberate and utterly without passion. The boy approached his uncle and stopped the man's heart with nothing more than the power of his mind. He did not rage. He did not weep. He simply reached out with his psychic abilities and ended a life as easily as snuffing out a candle. And in that moment, standing over the body of his uncle with the same calm detachment that would characterize so many of his later decisions, the being who would become the emperor came to a realization that would shape the course of human history. Humanity needed order. It needed law. It needed guidance and purpose, and a firm hand to steer it away from the darkness that was always pressing in from every side. Humanity needed a ruler, and there was no one else qualified for the job. Shortly after that pivotal moment, the boy left his village. He walked away from the only life he had known and made his way toward the first true city of human civilization, likely one of the great urban centers of ancient Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, where humanity was learning to build and trade and organize on a scale never before attempted. And there, in the cradle of civilization itself, the emperor began his true work, as a work that would not be completed for tens of thousands of years, if it could ever truly be said to be completed at all. The millennia that followed are among the most mysterious in the emperor's long life. Tens of thousands of years stretched out before him, and he spent them walking among humanity in secret, watching, waiting, and occasionally intervening in the great movements of history. He was a ghost in the machine of human civilization, a hidden hand that nudged and guided and sometimes shoved humanity in the direction he believed it needed to go. He took many forms during this time. He wore many faces. Some of those faces belong to figures that you would recognize from your own history books, though the law is deliberately coy about providing specific identifications for most of them. There is one notable exception. One identity that the law has explicitly connected to the emperor, at least through the testimony of his own son Horus. The emperor, according to this account, once walked the earth as Alexander the Great. And there is a particular detail that adds a haunting resonance to this claim. Alexander, as the histories tell us, wept before the river Hyphasis when he believed there were no more worlds to conquer. But the being behind those tears knew something that the generals and companions around him could not. There were more worlds, millions of them, scattered across a galaxy so vast that the human mind could barely conceive of its scale. And one day, when the time was right, he would reach out and claim them all. But that day was still far, far in the future. For now, the Emperor walked and watched and waited. As he studied humanity with the patience of a being who measured his life not in years or decades, or even centuries, but in millennia. He watched civilizations rise and fall. He saw empires bloom like flowers in the desert and wither just as quickly. He witnessed humanity's greatest achievements and its most terrible atrocities, its moments of breathtaking nobility and its descents into unspeakable cruelty. And through it all, he gathered knowledge. He refined his understanding of the species he had been born to protect. And he made plans. The Emperor was not idle during these hidden millennia. He was working, always working, on the grand project that consumed his existence. The details of that work are largely lost to history, but fragments survive. He is said to have founded early human civilizations, and to have guided the development of law and governance, and the basic structures of organized society. He appeared in various incarnations that were important to the history of humanity, sometimes as a conqueror, sometimes as a philosopher, sometimes as a simple farmer or craftsman, who happened to be in the right place at the right time to nudge events in a particular direction. The lore tells us that he took forms both male and female over the centuries, sometimes brutal, sometimes gentle, always purposeful. Every action he took during these hidden millennia was aimed at a single goal, preparing humanity for the challenges that lay ahead. And those challenges were far greater than anything the people of Earth could have imagined. Because while the Emperor walked among humanity in secret, studying its nature and guiding its development, and he was also becoming increasingly aware of a threat that dwarfed any earthly conflict or catastrophe. The warp, that dimension of raw psychic energy that exists alongside physical reality, was home to entities of unimaginable power and malice. The Chaos Gods, nourished by the emotions and psychic emanations of every sentient being in the galaxy, were growing stronger with each passing millennium. Their influence was spreading, their hunger was deepening, and their eyes were turning with increasing interest toward humanity, a species whose rapid psychic evolution was generating more and more of the emotional energy on which chaos fed. The Emperor understood the nature of this threat better than anyone alive. He had seen what the warp could do. He had felt the hunger of the entities that dwelled within it, and he knew, with the certainty that comes from psychic foresight and millennia of accumulated wisdom, that if humanity was not properly prepared, it would be consumed, not by any external enemy, but by the darkness that grew from its own collective unconscious, from the fear and rage and despair and excess that were the raw materials from which the Chaos Gods built their power. This knowledge drove everything the Emperor did, every alliance he forged, every civilization he built, every war he fought, every manipulation he orchestrated. All of it was in service of a single, overriding goal: to shepherd humanity through the perilous transition from a mundane species to a fully psychic one. Because that transition was coming, whether humanity was ready for it or not, more and more humans were being born with psychic abilities. And that number was only going to increase. If those abilities were properly understood and controlled, they could elevate humanity to heights that would make the achievements of every past civilization look like the scratchings of children in the sand. But if they were not controlled, if humanity stumbled blindly into its psychic awakening without guidance or protection, then the Chaos Gods would feast. Every unshielded psyker was a potential gateway for demonic entities to enter the material universe. Every uncontrolled psychic outburst was a beacon that drew the attention of things that should never be named. Humanity's own evolution was simultaneously its greatest hope and its most existential danger. The Emperor saw both sides of this equation with perfect clarity, and he resolved to tip the balance in humanity's favor. But to do that, he would need more than wisdom and foresight. He would need power, tools, allies, and above all, knowledge that existed beyond the boundaries of the material universe. Which brings us to one of the most pivotal and controversial events in the Emperor's long prehistory. His journey to the world of Molech and the bargain he struck at the gates of something that should never have been opened. Somewhere during the long ages before the Emperor revealed himself publicly, during the period known as the Dark Age of Technology, when humanity had already spread across the stars and built a civilization of staggering scientific achievement, the being who would become the Emperor undertook a journey that would change the course of galactic history. He traveled to a world called Molech, accompanied by several other perpetuals, including Olivia Soreka. They did not travel in secret. They arrived aboard a starship, a one-way vessel that brought them to this seemingly unremarkable night world, where massive bipedal war machines called knights strode across the landscape and feudal houses vied for dominance over the planet's surface. But Molech was not unremarkable. Beneath its surface, hidden from casual observation but impossible to conceal from a being of the Emperor's psychic sensitivity, was a gateway. Not a gateway in any physical sense, not a door or a tunnel or a passage that could be mapped with conventional instruments. This was a warp gate, a breach in the fabric of reality that led directly into the immaterial realm. A door into the dimension of raw psychic energy, madness, and predatory intelligence that humans would eventually learn to call the realm of chaos. The Emperor entered that gateway. Alone, as far as the most reliable accounts suggest, he passed through the barrier between the material universe and the warp, and found himself in a place where the normal rules of physics and logic ceased to apply. What happened next is a matter of enormous debate, both within the lore and among the fans who study it. The most commonly cited account, drawn primarily from the Horus Heresy novel Vengeful Spirit, tells us that the Emperor met the Chaos Gods themselves, that he stood before entities of such scope and power that they made the greatest mortal civilizations look like anthills, and he negotiated with them. He struck a bargain. The exact terms of that bargain have never been revealed, and the lore deliberately keeps this vague, allowing different interpretations to coexist and feeding the ambiguity that is so central to the 40k setting. What we know for certain is that the Emperor entered the warp gate on Molech and emerged with something he had not possessed before. He came back with the knowledge needed to create the Primarchs, the 20 superhuman sons who would serve as his greatest generals and instruments. This knowledge involved the combination of advanced genetic science with the energies of the warp itself, a fusion of material and immaterial techniques that no mortal scientist could have devised through conventional means. Some sources suggest that the Emperor also emerged with enhanced power, and that the already staggering scale of his psychic abilities was magnified by whatever transaction took place within the warp. Others argue that the Emperor was already incomprehensibly powerful before Molech, and that what he gained was purely informational, the specific techniques and understanding needed to imbue living flesh with the energies of the warp in a controlled and purposeful way. The truth likely lies somewhere in the ambiguity between these positions, as is so often the case in 40,000 lore. What is generally agreed upon is that the Emperor did not keep his end of whatever bargain he made. The Chaos Gods, for all their cosmic power and alien intelligence, believed that they had struck a deal with the most powerful mortal in existence, and that deal was supposed to benefit them. And perhaps they expected the Emperor to spread their worship among humanity, or to open more gateways, or to deliver some other payment that would increase their power and influence in the material realm. Whatever they expected, they did not receive it. The Emperor, it seems, had gone to the negotiating table with the full intention of taking what he needed and giving nothing in return. He cheated the gods of the warp. He stole from beings that most would consider it suicidal to even approach, and he walked away with the tools he needed to carry out his grand plan for humanity. This act of cosmic defiance earned him a title that would follow him across the millennia. The Chaos Gods and all their demonic servants began to call him the Anathema. He was not merely an enemy, he was their opposite, the embodiment of everything they were not. Where chaos was entropy and madness and the dissolution of all structure, the Emperor was order and purpose, and the imposition of will upon the universe. He was, in the most literal and metaphysical sense, the antithesis of chaos, and the dark gods recognized him as the single greatest threat to their existence. The Emperor left Molech behind, but not before entrusting Olivia Sarika with the task of guarding the warp gate. She would remain on that world for millennia, watching over the breach in reality that the Emperor had used, and ensuring that no one else would follow in his footsteps. It was a lonely vigil, one that would only end during the fires of the Horus heresy, when the Emperor's most favored son would come to Molech, seeking the same power his father had obtained. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Shint, the bargain at Molech, gave the Emperor the knowledge he needed, but he still had to wait for the right moment to act. And that moment would not come for thousands of years yet. The galaxy first had to endure one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, an event so devastating that it would reduce the species from a star-spanning civilization to scattered, isolated pockets of survival fighting for their lives on worlds cut off from each other by the screaming storms of the warp. The galaxy had to pass through the Age of Strife. To understand why the Age of Strife was so devastating, you need to understand what came before it. Before the darkness, before the isolation, before the screaming and the dying, there was the age of technology, and by every account that has survived, it was glorious. Humanity had spread across the stars, us colonizing millions of worlds and building a civilization of breathtaking scientific achievement. The technology of this era was so advanced that even 10,000 years later, the greatest minds of the Imperium would regard its artifacts with awe and incomprehension. Artificial intelligences, self-replicating construction systems, weapons that could unmake entire star systems, these were the everyday tools of a civilization that had seemingly conquered every challenge the galaxy could throw at it. But it could not conquer itself. The exact sequence of events that led to the fall of this great human federation is poorly documented. Some accounts speak of a devastating war against the men of iron, artificial intelligences that turned against their creators in a rebellion that consumed entire star systems. Others point to the gradual increase in warp storm activity that made interstellar travel increasingly dangerous and eventually impossible. Still others suggest that the growing number of human psychers, whose uncontrolled abilities made them walking gateways for demonic entities, created a cascading series of catastrophes that no amount of technology could prevent. Whatever the specific causes, the result was the same. The great human federation collapsed. The warp storms that had been growing in intensity for millennia erupted into a galaxy-wide maelstrom that severed every interstellar connection, every trade route, every communication link that had bound human civilization together. Worlds that had relied on imports for food suddenly found themselves starving, as colonies that had depended on technology they could not manufacture watched helplessly as their machines broke down and could not be repaired. And on world after world, uncontrolled psychers became conduits for demonic incursion, unleashing horrors from the warp upon populations that had no understanding of what was happening to them and no means of defense. The Age of Strife, also known as Old Night, lasted for approximately 5,000 years. 5,000 years of isolation, degradation, and horror. 5,000 years during which the scattered remnants of human civilization were thrown back on their own resources, forced to survive without the interconnected support structure that had sustained them for millennia. Many worlds fell entirely. Their populations were wiped out by famine, war, demonic incursion, or the alien predators that sensed weakness and moved in to feast. Other worlds survived but were transformed beyond recognition, their cultures warped by millennia of isolation and hardship into something that would have been unrecognizable to their ancestors. And at the center of it all, on Terra itself, the cradle of human civilization, things were no better. Old Earth had devolved into a nightmare of warring factions, techno-barbarian kingdoms ruled by despots and madmen who fought over the scraps of technology that remained from the fallen Golden Age. The planet's surface was scarred by atomic weapons and more exotic armaments, its population enslaved or brutalized by dozens of competing warlords who had carved up the ancient homeworld of humanity into personal fiefdoms. The Emperor was there through all of it. Yet he had been present during the age of technology, though the exact nature of his activities during that era remains unclear. He had watched as the Federation built its gleaming cities and pushed the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. He had seen the warning signs, the gathering storm clouds in the warp, the increasing instability of the Psyker population, the hubris of a civilization that believed it had conquered every challenge. And when the collapse came, he endured it alongside the rest of humanity, watching as everything was lost. As 5,000 years of darkness descended upon the species he had sworn to protect. But the Emperor was not merely enduring. He was waiting. Waiting for a specific moment. Yes, a specific alignment of circumstances that his prescient mind had identified as the necessary precondition for his emergence from the shadows. That moment came in the late 29th millennium, when the warp storms that had isolated humanity for 5,000 years finally began to abate. The reason for this calming was itself a catastrophe, the birth of a new chaos god. Deep within the warp, the collective psychic excess and sensation-seeking of the ancient Eldar civilization had coalesced into something terrible, a new deity of pleasure and pain called Slanesh. The birth scream of this new god tore through the warp with such force that it ripped open a permanent wound in reality, the Eye of Terror, and exterminated the vast majority of the Eldar species in a single apocalyptic moment. But that same birth scream also had the effect of calming the warp storms that had plagued the galaxy for millennia. The turbulence that had made interstellar travel impossible subsided, not entirely, but enough that the stars were once again within reach. And the Emperor, who had been waiting for this exact moment with the patience of a being who measured his plans in millennia, finally stepped out of the shadows. The time for hiding was over. The time for action had finally come. When the Emperor finally revealed himself to the people of Terra, it was not as a diplomat or a philosopher or a gentle leader offering hope. It was as a conqueror. And the instrument of that conquest was something the world had never seen before.
And honestly, this is the part of the lore that really gets me. Like, I've been deep in this hobby for a while, and every time I come back to the Emperor's story, I find something new that hits different. The thing that always sticks with me is that he's not a clean hero. He's not even a villain. He's just this impossibly burdened guy who made the best calls he could with what he had, and it still wasn't enough. And I think that's why so many of us connect with this setting more than any other sci-fi out there. It doesn't hand you easy answers, it makes you sit with the mess. But anyways, I just wanted to share that because I genuinely love talking about this stuff with you all. And your comments on the last video honestly keep me going through a rough week. So thank you for that, and yeah, let's continue with the video.
He called them the Thunder Warriors. To understand what the Thunder Warriors were, well, you have to understand what Terra looked like in the late 29th millennium. This was not the dignified, sacred cradle of civilization that later imperial propaganda would portray. This was a hellscape, a world that had spent 5,000 years tearing itself apart, ruled by dozens of competing warlords, each commanding their own private armies, equipped with whatever scraps of advanced technology they had managed to hoard or salvage from the ruins of the old civilization. Some of these techno-barbarian kingdoms possessed weapons of staggering destructive potential. Atomic weapons were common. Genetic modification was widespread, though often crude and poorly understood. The people of Terra lived in a state of perpetual warfare, yet their lives measured in cycles of violence that had persisted for so many generations that no one could remember anything else. Into this nightmare stepped the Emperor, and he did not step gently. In the secret laboratories he had established beneath what would eventually become the Imperial Palace, He had been working for years, perhaps decades or centuries, on the creation of a new kind of warrior. The Thunder Warriors were the result of that work. They were genetically enhanced super soldiers, created through alchemical augmentation, somatic gene sculpting, and muscle grafting techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was biologically possible. They were larger than ordinary men, stronger, faster, more durable. They were weapons shaped in human form, designed for a single purpose: to win the war that would unite Terra under a single banner. But the Thunder Warriors were also fundamentally flawed. The processes used to create them were imprecise, rushed, the product of desperate necessity rather than careful refinement. Unlike the Space Marines who would follow them, the Thunder Warriors were unstable. Their genetic enhancements were prone to deterioration over time, leading to physical breakdown and mental instability. They aged at roughly the same rate as normal humans. They were aggressive, volatile, difficult to control. They were not soldiers for an empire. They were soldiers for a war, and once that war was won, they would have no place in the world they had helped create. The Emperor knew this from the beginning, while it is one of the first and most unsettling examples of the cold pragmatism that would define so many of his decisions across the centuries. He created the Thunder Warriors knowing that they were temporary tools, expendable instruments whose usefulness had an expiration date. He poured the combined knowledge of millennia into their creation, gave them the best weapons and armor that the technology of the age could provide, and sent them out to die in his name. And die they did, in their thousands, fighting across the blood-soaked battlefields of a world that had known nothing but war for 5,000 years. The Unification Wars, as they would come to be known, were a campaign of conquest on a scale that later imperial scholars found difficult to believe. The battles lasted for solar weeks at a time, with body counts in the millions. Our mountains were sundered, continents were split by the fury of the fighting. The Emperor led his Thunder Warriors against every warlord, every techno-barbarian kingdom, every petty tyrant who dared to stand against his vision of a unified humanity, and one by one, he brought them all to heel. Some of these campaigns were straightforward military conquests, overwhelming force applied with ruthless efficiency against enemies who could not hope to match the power of the Thunder Warriors. Others were more nuanced. The conquest of Albia, a powerful nation-state whose defenders fielded their own proto-dreadnoughts and heavily armored Ironside soldiers, proved particularly challenging. The Albions refused to kneel, and in battle after battle, they managed to hold back the Emperor's forces, though only at staggering cost. In the end, the Emperor did something unexpected. He called a ceasefire. He appeared before the Albion clan lords unarmed, dressed in white and crimson, and spoke to them of his vision. He did not threaten. He offered. He promised glory among the stars, a purpose greater than anything the Albions had ever imagined. And to the shock of many, the warlords of Albia, seeing in the Emperor something different from the countless tyrants who had come before, accepted his terms and became some of the most zealous supporters of unification. Not every enemy received such generous treatment. The Antarctic civilization that had built its culture around religious worship was obliterated with nuclear weapons, in part because they had killed imperial emissaries, but also because their devotion to religion represented everything the Emperor was determined to destroy. The priest-king of the Moreland Sen Confederacy was captured by the custodians, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, and publicly executed after a battle in which the Emperor himself had led the charge, despite being outnumbered 7-1. The Ethnarchy, whose formidable forces included genetically modified warriors, enslaved psychers, and dangerous weapons from the Dark Age of technology, required 2 separate campaigns to defeat, the first costing 20,000 Thunder Warrior lives and 1 million other casualties before the Emperor was forced to withdraw and regroup. Throughout these campaigns, the Emperor was building something alongside the war effort. He was creating the infrastructure of governance. He was establishing the foundations of the Imperium that would eventually span the galaxy. He was training the first regiments of what would become the Imperial Army, ordinary human soldiers who fought alongside the Thunder Warriors and provided the organizational backbone of the conquering force. These regiments would eventually be called the Old Hundred, and they would form the core of the military that would carry the Emperor's will beyond the stars. But as the unification wars drew toward their conclusion, the Emperor faced a problem that he had anticipated from the very beginning. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose. They had won the war. But they were also increasingly unstable, both physically and mentally, and they represented a potential threat to the fragile peace that the Emperor was trying to build. They were too powerful to be left to their own devices, too volatile to be integrated into a peacetime society, and too proud to accept retirement gracefully. Worse, there were rumblings of discontent among them. Some had begun to suspect that the Emperor's plans did not include a future for the warriors who had bled and died to make those plans possible. The official imperial chronicles tell of the last battle of the Unification Wars, the Battle of Mount Ararat, fought in the Kingdom of Urartu. According to the heroic version of events, the Thunder Warriors fought to the last man in this final engagement, dying gloriously to secure the Emperor's ultimate victory. The famed Thunder Warrior, Arictaranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, is said to have raised the banner of lightning at the Declaration of Unity before succumbing to his wounds. It was portrayed as a fitting and noble end for warriors who had given everything for the cause. The truth was far darker. The Thunder Warriors were not all killed in battle at Mount Ararat. They were culled, deliberately and systematically eliminated by the Emperor's own forces, likely the Adeptus Custodes, the golden armored guardians, who served as the Emperor's personal bodyguard and whose loyalty was absolute. The story of their heroic last stand was a fabrication, a convenient myth created to give the Imperium's founding a more palatable narrative. The real ending involved the Thunder Warriors being lured into a final engagement and then slaughtered by the very forces they had served. This is one of the most troubling aspects of the Emperor's character. He created living, thinking, feeling beings, gave them a sense of purpose and belonging, used them to achieve his goals, and then disposed of them when they were no longer useful. He did it coldly, efficiently, and without apparent remorse. The Thunder Warriors believed in his vision. They fought and died for his dream of a unified humanity, and in return, they received a shallow grave and a pretty lie about their sacrifice. It would not be the last time the Emperor's grand vision required a price to be paid in blood and betrayal. With the Thunder Warriors gone, and Terra finally unified under a single ruler for the first time in 5,000 years, the Emperor turned his attention to the next phase of his plan. Yet the unification of Terra had always been only the first step in a much grander design. The Emperor did not intend to rule one world. He intended to rule a galaxy, but to do that, he needed a new kind of warrior, one who could endure the challenges of a galactic campaign without the fatal flaws that had doomed the Thunder Warriors. He needed soldiers who were not merely weapons, but leaders, explorers, administrators, the vanguard of a civilization that would span 1,000,000 worlds. He needed the Space Marines, and to lead them, he needed something even greater. In the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, in the very same facility where the Thunder Warriors had been created, and from which they had marched to their deaths, the Emperor undertook the most ambitious project in the history of human genetics. Drawing on the knowledge he had gained at Molech, the forbidden techniques that fused material science with the energies of the warp, he created 20 beings of unprecedented power and perfection. The Primarchs. Each Primarch was crafted from the Emperor's own genetic code, modified and shaped to embody a specific aspect of warfare, leadership, or governance. They were not simply enhanced humans. They were something else entirely, beings that blurred the line between mortal and divine, between the material and the immaterial. They were designed to be everything that the Thunder Warriors had been, and infinitely more, not just warriors but generals, statesmen, artists, scientists, each one a near-perfect expression of a particular facet of human potential. raised to its highest possible form. They were taller than any normal human, are stronger, faster, more intelligent, possessed of a charismatic aura that could inspire absolute devotion in those who served them. They were, in every measurable way, the closest things to gods that human genetic science could produce. The Emperor created 20 of them, gestating them in specially designed capsules within his underground laboratory. He worked alongside the perpetual Erda, who contributed her own genetic material to the project, making her in some metaphysical sense the mother of the Primarchs. The biotechnical division director Amar Astarte oversaw much of the practical work. But the core of the creation, the spark that elevated the Primarchs from mere genetic constructs to beings of genuine transcendence, came from the knowledge the Emperor had obtained at Molech. Had he imbued his creations with the energies of the warp itself, giving them abilities and characteristics that no purely material science could have produced. This made them magnificent. It also, tragically, made them vulnerable to the very forces he was trying to protect humanity from. The Chaos Gods saw what the Emperor was doing, and they were afraid. Not a fear born of panic or weakness, but the cold, calculating alarm of entities who recognized an existential threat. The Emperor's plan, if it succeeded, would unite humanity under a single, organized, psychically guided civilization that would drastically reduce the emotional chaos on which the warp gods fed. The Primarchs, leading legions of space marines in a galaxy-spanning crusade, would impose order on a universe that chaos thrived on disordering. As the Emperor's grand vision was nothing less than the domestication of the warp itself, the gradual starvation of the Chaos Gods through the elimination of the fear, rage, despair, and excess that gave them power. The Dark Gods could not allow this, and so, in an act of cosmic sabotage, they struck at the Emperor's most precious creation before it could be completed. The gestation capsules containing the infant Primarchs were ripped from their laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains and scattered across the galaxy through the warp. 20 infants, each carrying a portion of the Emperor's own genetic legacy, each imbued with warp energies that made them simultaneously magnificent and vulnerable, were hurled through the dimension of madness and deposited on 20 different worlds, as far from terror and from each other as the Chaos Gods could manage. There is debate about exactly how this happened. Some accounts attributed entirely to the Chaos Gods, acting through their servants in the warp, to breach the laboratory's defenses and snatch the Primarchs away. Others point to the perpetual Erda, who may have been manipulated by chaos into opening a warp vortex herself, driven by a desire to save her children from whatever fate the Emperor had planned for them. Still others suggest that members of the Word-Bearers Legion, sent back through time by demonic entities, may have sabotaged the Geller fields that protected the laboratory, creating the opening that the Chaos Gods needed. And there is even a theory, entertained by several of the Primarchs themselves, that the Emperor engineered the scattering deliberately, as that their dispersal across the galaxy and their upbringing on different worlds was part of his plan all along. Whatever the truth, the result was devastating. The Emperor's grand design had suffered a catastrophic setback before it had even truly begun. His 20 perfect generals, his instruments of galactic conquest, his tools for reshaping the destiny of the human race, were gone, scattered to the far corners of a galaxy that was still largely cut off from interstellar travel, growing up on worlds that would shape them in ways the Emperor could not control and perhaps could not even predict. But the Emperor was nothing if not adaptive. If he could not have his Primarchs, he would use the next best thing. From the genetic samples that had been derived from the Primarchs' genomes before their loss, he created a new caste of warriors. But these were the legions Astartes, the Space Marine legions of the first founding. 20 legions, each based on the genetic template of one of the lost Primarchs, each a pale reflection of their gene father's abilities, but still vastly superior to any unaugmented human soldier. Where a single Primarch was a near-divine being of staggering power, A space marine was merely superhuman. But there could be thousands of them, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. What they lacked in individual magnificence, they would make up for in numbers and discipline, and the shared genetic bond that bound each legion into a brotherhood of war. With his space marine legions assembled, and the warp storms finally calming enough to permit interstellar travel, the Emperor launched the next phase of his plan. This was the Great Crusade, and it would be the single largest military campaign in the history of the galaxy. 200 years of relentless expansion, during which the armies of the Emperor pushed outward from Terra in every direction, conquering, liberating, and incorporating every human world they encountered into the growing Imperium of man. The Great Crusade was not merely a war of conquest. It was a war of reunification. Across the galaxy, thousands of human worlds had survived the age of strife in isolation, each developing its own culture, technology, and government. Some had thrived, building sophisticated civilizations that rivaled pre-strife standards. Others had degenerated into barbarism, their populations reduced to subsistence-level survival on worlds that had once been thriving colonies. And some had been conquered by alien species, as their human populations enslaved, or worse, by Xenos predators who had taken advantage of humanity's weakness during its long dark night. The Emperor's forces brought all of these worlds into the Imperium by diplomacy where possible and by force where necessary. Compliance was the term used, and it was applied with varying degrees of gentleness, depending on the legion conducting the operation and the level of resistance encountered. Some worlds welcomed the arrival of the Emperor's forces with open arms, grateful to be reconnected with the broader human civilization. Others fought back, unwilling to surrender their independence to a distant ruler on a world they had never heard of. These worlds were brought into compliance through military action that could range from precise, surgical strikes to the complete annihilation of all resistance. And as the Great Crusade expanded the boundaries of the Imperium, one by one, the Emperor found his lost sons. The Primarchs had landed on their respective worlds as infants and grown to adulthood at an accelerated rate, each quickly rising to prominence on whatever world they called home. Some became kings, others became warlords, scientists, philosophers, or rebels. Their personalities and worldviews had been profoundly shaped by their environments, a factor that would have enormous consequences when the time came for them to take up the roles the Emperor had designed for them. The first Primarch to be recovered, according to the most commonly accepted account, was Horus. Found on a world called Chthoniya, a mining planet eaten hollow by millennia of resource extraction, our Horus was reunited with the Emperor early in the Crusade. The bond between them was immediate and deep. Of all the Primarchs, Horus was said to be the Emperor's favorite, the son who most closely mirrored his father's combination of martial prowess, political acumen, and personal charisma. Horus became the model against which all the other Primarchs would be measured, and his relationship with the Emperor would eventually become the axis around which the entire setting would turn. One by one, the other Primarchs were found and given command of their respective legions. Each reunion was different. Some Primarchs recognized the Emperor on sight and pledged their allegiance immediately, overwhelmed by the psychic resonance between creator and creation. Others required convincing. Leman Russ, the feral Primarch of Fenris, only submitted after being bested by the Emperor in a feat of strength. Ferrus Manus demanded a contest of craftsmanship. Vulcan, who had grown up on the lethal death world of Nocturne, required a test of endurance. And then there was Angron, the Primarch of the 12th Legion, who refused entirely. Found on a world where he had been enslaved and forced to fight as a gladiator, with cybernetic devices called the Butcher's Nails, hammered into his skull that filled him with constant, overwhelming rage, Angron had no interest in the Emperor's vision or the Imperium's grand design. He wanted to die fighting alongside his fellow gladiators in a doomed rebellion against their oppressors. The Emperor, rather than earning Angron's loyalty through patience and understanding, simply abducted him. her teleporting him aboard his flagship and leaving Angron's comrades to fight and die without him. It was an act of callous pragmatism that Angron never forgave, and it planted seeds of resentment that would bear terrible fruit in the centuries to come. Each Primarch brought something unique to the crusade. Robert Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, brought administrative genius and a talent for building functioning civilizations in the wake of military conquest. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists brought unmatched expertise in fortification and defensive warfare. The Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, brought lightning speed and tactical mobility. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors brought a grim, mathematical approach to siege warfare that made him the Emperor's hammer against the most heavily defended positions. In each Primarch was a tool designed for a specific purpose, and together they formed an instrument of conquest that had never been equaled in the history of the galaxy. But for all their magnificence, the Primarchs were also deeply, fundamentally flawed. This was not an accident. It may not even have been a mistake. The warp energies that had been used to enhance them had given each Primarch extraordinary abilities, but those same energies had also made them susceptible to the influence of chaos. Each Primarch embodied not only the best aspects of the human condition, but also some of its worst. Angron carried rage so profound that it defined his every waking moment. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, was consumed by visions of darkness and cruelty that drove him to acts of unspeakable sadism. Lorgar, the most spiritual of the Primarchs, carried a need for faith and worship that would eventually lead him to the altar of the Dark Gods. Even the most stable and loyal of the Primarchs, figures like Guilliman and Dawn and the Khan, carried flaws and blind spots that would be ruthlessly exploited when the time came. And the Emperor knew this, or at least he knew enough. He had created beings of magnificent power and terrible vulnerability, and he had done so knowingly because the alternative, facing the galaxy without them, was worse. This is the central tragedy of the Primarch project and of the Emperor's grand design as a whole. Every solution he devised carried within it the seeds of a new problem. Every tool he created could be turned against him. Every step forward brought with it the possibility of a catastrophic step back. The Emperor was playing a game of cosmic chess against opponents who had existed for millions of years, with pieces that had minds and wills of their own, and the margin for error was non-existent. For approximately 200 years, the Great Crusade expanded the Imperium's borders at a breathtaking pace. Millions of worlds were brought into compliance. Alien civilizations that had preyed on isolated human populations were destroyed or driven to the farthest margins of the galaxy. The gene seed of the Primarchs produced hundreds of thousands of space marines, each one a superhuman warrior capable of feats that would have seemed miraculous to the ordinary humans fighting alongside them. The Imperial army, composed of billions of unaugmented soldiers, provided the numerical backbone of the conquering force. The Mechanicum of Mars, as an ancient techno-religious civilization that worshipped the Emperor as the Omnissiah, the physical avatar of their machine god, provided the industrial capacity and technological expertise that kept the war machine running. It was, by any measure, the most successful military campaign in the history of the galaxy. And the Emperor was at its heart, a figure of such transcendent power and vision that his mere presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of an engagement. When he walked among his soldiers, they fought with a fervor that bordered on the divine. When he spoke, even the most hardened cynics found themselves moved to tears. He was everything a leader should be, and the Imperium he was building seemed destined to endure for eternity. But the Emperor had a secret, a plan within the plan, was a grand ambition that dwarfed even the conquest of the galaxy. And it was this secret that would require him to step back from the Great Crusade, to hand the reins of command to another, and to withdraw into the depths of the Imperial Palace on Terra to work on something that he believed was far more important than any military campaign. He was going to free humanity from the warp itself. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor had insisted on a specific cultural doctrine for the Imperium. He called it the Imperial Truth, and at its core was a radical, almost shocking idea, at least by the standards of what the Imperium would eventually become. The imperial truth was atheism. Not merely the absence of worship, but the active, enforced rejection of all religious belief. The Emperor decreed that there were no gods, that the supernatural entities of the warp were not divine beings worthy of worship, but natural phenomena, dangerous and powerful certainly, but no more deserving of reverence than a hurricane or an earthquake. Religion, the Emperor argued, was the source of humanity's greatest weaknesses. It encouraged superstition, divided populations along arbitrary lines, and most importantly, it fed the chaos gods. Every prayer, every ritual, every act of worship directed toward the entities of the warp strengthened them, gave them more power to corrupt and destroy. The only way to defeat chaos was to starve it, and the only way to starve it was to eliminate the religious impulse entirely. This was not a popular policy. Billions of humans across the galaxy had built their cultures and their sense of identity around religious belief. The Great Crusade frequently encountered worlds where worship was the foundation of society, and on those worlds, the arrival of the Emperor's forces meant the destruction of everything the population held sacred. Churches were torn down, priests were silenced, sacred texts were burned. The spiritual traditions that had sustained communities through the 5,000 years of the Age of Strife were systematically dismantled and replaced with the cold, rational materialism of the imperial truth. The Emperor himself demonstrated his commitment to this policy in the most dramatic fashion possible. On Terra itself, as one of the final acts of the unification era, he personally oversaw the destruction of the last remaining church. This was the Church of the Lightning Stone, the final religious institution on humanity's homeworld. And the Emperor did not merely close it, he burned it. He went to the church himself, spoke with its last priest, debated the value of faith versus reason, and then watched as the building was reduced to ashes. It was a statement of intent that could not have been more clear. In the Emperor's Imperium, there would be no room for gods. But there was a bitter irony at the heart of this policy, because even as the Emperor denied the existence of gods and demanded that humanity abandon all religious belief, a cult was growing within the very Imperium he was building. A cult that worshipped him. The Lectitio Divinitatis, a text written by none other than the Primarch Lorgar, postulated that the Emperor was himself a divine being worthy of worship. And despite the Emperor's explicit and repeated condemnation of this idea, the cult spread. It spread because the Emperor, for all his insistence that he was merely a very powerful human being, seemed to his followers to be something more. He was immortal. He wielded power that defied rational explanation. His presence inspired feelings of awe and devotion that bordered on the religious. To ordinary humans, who had lived through the horrors of the Age of Strife and emerged into the light of the Great Crusade, the Emperor did not look like a man. He looked like a god, and no amount of official doctrine could change that. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, took this impulse further than anyone else. He did not merely believe in the Emperor's divinity, he made it the foundation of his legion's entire culture. Every world the Word-Bearers brought into compliance was not merely conquered, but converted. Its population inducted into a new faith that placed the Emperor at the center of a cosmic hierarchy. Lorgar built cathedrals and temples on every world he touched, composed hymns and prayers and liturgical texts, trained priests, and established religious orders, all dedicated to the worship of the God Emperor of mankind. The Emperor tolerated this for a time, perhaps longer than he should have. But eventually, the Word-Bearers' progress through the Crusades slowed to a crawl. While other legions were conquering star systems in rapid succession, the Word-Bearers were spending months or years on each world, meticulously converting its population to the worship of the Emperor. The military gains were minimal compared to the resources being invested, and more importantly, from the Emperor's perspective, Lorgar was doing the one thing that the Emperor had specifically forbidden. He was building a religion. The Emperor's response was devastating. He ordered the Ultramarines Legion, under Robert Guilliman, to travel to the world of Kur, where Lorgar had built his most magnificent monument to the God Emperor, the great city of Monarchia. The Ultramarines destroyed the city completely, razed it to the ground, and then, in a moment of public humiliation that would have consequences echoing across millennia, the Emperor summoned Lorgar and the entire Wordbearers Legion and forced them to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement. He berated Lorgar for his failure to adhere to the imperial truth. He told his son, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that the Wordbearers' devotion to worship was a failure, an embarrassment, as a betrayal of everything the Imperium stood for, and he demanded that Lorgar abandon his faith and return to the business of military conquest. Lorgar knelt in the ashes of Monarchia, and something inside him broke. The son who had loved the Emperor more devoutly than any other, who had built his entire identity around the worship of his father, was told that everything he had done was wrong, everything he believed was a lie, and every cathedral he had built was an insult. It was a wound that would never heal. And in the depths of his anguish, Lorgar went looking for gods who would accept his worship. He found them in the warp. He found the Chaos gods, and they welcomed him with open arms. The first seeds of the Horus heresy were planted not in any grand strategic failure, but in a father's inability to understand his son's need for faith, and a son's inability to survive without it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again, because before the heresy, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart, the Emperor had a dream. And that dream was the most ambitious project he had ever undertaken, a project that, had it succeeded, would have changed the destiny of humanity forever. The Webway Project, the Emperor's great work, the secret that he kept from almost everyone, including most of his own sons. To understand the Webway Project, you need to understand the Webway itself. Long before humanity had taken its first steps beyond the cradle of Earth, another civilization had ruled the galaxy. The Eldar, an ancient and powerful race of psychic beings, had built an empire that spanned millions of worlds. And the foundation of that empire was the Webway, a vast network of tunnels and corridors that existed in the space between the material universe and the warp. The Webway was not part of the warp, nor was it part of real space. It occupied a dimensional middle ground, a realm where the dangers of warp travel, the time distortions, the demonic predators, the maddening unreality, simply did not exist. Travel through the Webway was instantaneous, safe, and utterly beyond the reach of chaos. The Eldar had used the Webway to build their empire, to connect their worlds in a network of instantaneous transportation that made their civilization functionally unified across the entire galaxy. And when the Eldar fell, destroyed by the birth of Slanesh and the cataclysm that accompanied it, the Webway remained. Damaged, fragmented, haunted by the echoes of its builder's demise, but still functional, still there, waiting to be used by anyone with the knowledge and power to access it. The Emperor had found a way in. Beneath the deserts of Asia, buried under millions of tons of sand and rock, he had discovered an ancient device of unknown origin. This device, which would eventually become known as the Golden Throne, was capable of creating a portal into the Webway. It was technology from the dark age of technology, or perhaps from an even earlier era, and even the Emperor was uncertain of its exact origins or the full extent of its capabilities. But he understood its potential, and that potential was breathtaking. If the Emperor could create a stable entry point into the Webway on Terra, and if he could extend the Webway network with new tunnels built by human hands, then humanity would no longer need to travel through the warp at all. Ships could enter the Webway on one side of the galaxy and emerge on the other in the blink of an eye, without ever exposing themselves to the horrors that lurked in the immaterial realm. The entire foundation of Chaos's power, the vulnerability of human ships and travelers to demonic predation during warp transit, would be eliminated. And with it, the single greatest danger facing the human species would be neutralized. But the Webway project was more than just a transportation system. It was the key to the Emperor's ultimate plan for humanity, because the Emperor did not simply want to protect humanity from chaos. He wanted to evolve it beyond chaos entirely. He envisioned a future in which the entire human race would transition into a fully psychic species. A race of beings with complete mastery over their own psychic potential, no longer vulnerable to the predatory entities of the warp because they would be shielded by the Webway's protective barriers. Within the safety of the Webway, humanity could undergo its psychic evolution without fear of demonic corruption or warp-spawned madness. The species would ascend to a level of power and sophistication that would rival or surpass even the ancient Eldar at their height. This was the dream. This was the vision that had driven the Emperor across tens of thousands of years, through the long patience of his hidden millennia, through the brutality of the Unification Wars, through the blood and thunder of the Great Crusade. Everything he had done, every sacrifice he had made, every terrible decision he had justified in the name of the greater good, or all of it was aimed at this single, shimmering goal. A humanity free of chaos, psychically ascendant, unified within the Webway, masters of their own destiny in a galaxy that had been hostile to them for as long as they had existed. To achieve this dream, the Emperor had to work in secret. The Webway project was known only to a handful of his most trusted advisors. Even most of the Primarchs were kept in the dark, for reasons that were both practical and strategic. The Navy's Nobilite, the powerful guild of mutant navigators whose psychic abilities made warp travel possible, would have seen the Webway project as an existential threat to their monopoly on interstellar travel, and would have resisted it with every resource at their disposal. The Chaos Gods themselves, if they learned what the Emperor was doing, would have directed every ounce of their power toward preventing it. The project had to remain hidden until it was too far advanced to be stopped. And so, approximately 200 years into the Great Crusade, at the very height of the Imperium's expansion and power, the Emperor made a decision that shocked his sons and his generals. He withdrew from the front lines of the Crusade and returned to Terra. He named Horus, his most trusted and capable son, as War Master, the supreme commander of all Imperial military forces, and gave him authority to continue the crusade in the Emperor's absence. And then he retreated into the depths of the Imperial Palace, into the vast underground complex known as the Imperial Dungeon, to work on the Golden Throne and the Webway portal it controlled. The Primarchs were hurt by this decision. So many of them felt abandoned, confused, even betrayed. Their father, the being around whom their entire existence revolved, had left them without explanation, retreating behind closed doors to pursue a project he refused to discuss. The resentment this generated was significant and varied from Primarch to Primarch. Some, like Guilliman and Dawn, accepted the Emperor's decision with stoic loyalty, trusting that their father's reasons were sound even if those reasons were not shared. Others, like Perturabo and Angron, saw it as yet another sign of their father's cold indifference to the feelings and needs of his sons. And Horus, the newly appointed War Master, found himself burdened with a responsibility that was never meant for him, expected to fill the shoes of a being whose power and authority he could never truly replicate. And the Webway project consumed the Emperor's attention almost entirely. Using the Golden Throne as both a portal generator and a psychic amplifier, he directed legions of tech priests and laborers through the gateway and into the Webway, where they began constructing new tunnels that would extend the network to connect with the existing Eldar corridors. This was painstaking and dangerous work. The original Webway tunnels had been built from a psychically resistant material that the Eldar had mastered and that human science could not replicate. The new human-built sections were therefore vulnerable to the warp in a way that the original tunnels were not. Only the Emperor's psychic power, channeled through the Golden Throne, could protect these new sections from demonic intrusion. While this meant that the Emperor had to remain on the Golden Throne at almost all times, he became a prisoner of his own project, his mind stretched between the demands of maintaining the Webway portal, directing the construction efforts, and continuing to power the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that made warp travel possible for Imperial ships across the galaxy. He was doing the work of a god, and even for a being of his staggering psychic power, it was almost too much. And then Magnus ruined everything. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion, was the most psychically gifted of all the Emperor's sons. He was, in many ways, the Primarch most closely aligned with his father's own nature, a being of immense psychic power and insatiable intellectual curiosity. He was also, by several accounts, the Primarch that the Emperor had originally intended to sit upon the Golden Throne. Magnus was supposed to be the key to the Webway project, the psyker powerful enough to share the burden of maintaining the portal and the Webway defenses with his father. But Magnus had a fatal flaw. His thirst for knowledge, particularly forbidden knowledge, led him again and again into contact with the entities of the warp, and his confidence in his own ability to resist their influence was as limitless as it was ultimately misplaced. When Magnus learned of Horus's betrayal through his own psychic scrying, he was faced with an impossible choice. The Emperor had forbidden the use of sorcery at the Council of Nicaea, a decree aimed specifically at Magnus and his legion. But the news that Magnus had discovered is that the Emperor's most trusted son was planning to rebel against him, was too important to deliver through any conventional means. Normal communication across the vast distances of the galaxy was too slow, too unreliable, and so Magnus, driven by what he believed was noble intent, used a forbidden psychic ritual of enormous power to contact the Emperor directly. The ritual worked. Magnus's message reached the Emperor on Terra, but the psychic backlash of what Magnus had done was catastrophic. His spell tore through the Emperor's carefully constructed psychic wards around the Imperial Palace like a storm through paper. It ripped open breaches in the webway itself, creating warp rifts through which the demons of chaos poured in countless numbers. And thousands of tech priests and laborers, working in the human-built sections of the webway, were slaughtered in moments. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's most elite warriors, were thrown into a desperate battle to prevent the demonic horde from pouring through the Golden Throne's portal and flooding into the Imperial Palace and Terra itself. In a single act of well-intentioned foolishness, Magnus the Red destroyed the Webway project. The Emperor's dream, the work of millennia, the shining vision of a humanity freed from the grip of chaos, was shattered. The Emperor was forced to remain on the Golden Throne permanently, using every ounce of his psychic power to keep the ruined portal sealed against the demonic tide that now pressed against it constantly. He could not leave the throne. He could not pursue the Webway project. He could not even take direct command of the defense against the rebellion that was now tearing his Imperium apart. The Emperor was trapped, and the Horus heresy was about to begin in earnest. The Horus heresy, the single most catastrophic event in the history of the Imperium of man. The betrayal that shattered a galaxy-spanning civilization and condemned humanity to 10,000 years of stagnation, suffering, and slow decline. And at its center, the relationship between a father and the son he had trusted above all others. To understand how Horus fell, you have to understand what he was. Horus Lupercal was, by virtually every account, the most complete of the Emperor's creations. Where other Primarchs excelled in specific areas, Horus excelled in everything. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, a skilled diplomat, and a fearsome warrior. He possessed a combination of warmth, intelligence, and authority that made people want to follow him, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine admiration and love. He was the Primarch who most closely resembled the Emperor himself, and the Emperor treated him accordingly. During the Great Crusade, Horus had fought at his father's side more often than any other Primarch. He had been the first son recovered, the first to be given command of his own legion, the first to earn the Emperor's explicit trust and affection. When the Emperor chose a war master to lead the crusade in his absence, the choice was obvious. Horus was the best of them, the brightest, the most capable, the most trusted, and it was precisely this closeness, this elevation above his brothers, That made his fall so devastating when it came. The corruption of Horus did not happen overnight. It was a process, carefully orchestrated by the agents of chaos who had been working to undermine the Imperium since its founding. The word-bearers, who had secretly turned to chaos worship after Lorgar's humiliation at Monarchia, planted the initial seeds. Chaplain Erebus, one of the most manipulative figures in the entire setting, engineered a situation in which Horus was gravely wounded during a campaign on the world of Davin. While hovering between life and death, Horus was subjected to a dark ritual by the Serpent Lodge of Davin, a chaos cult operating under the guise of a warrior tradition. During this ritual, Horus's soul was drawn into the warp, where he was shown visions by the chaos gods. These visions were carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to be devastating. Horus was shown a future in which the Emperor sat upon the golden throne as a god, worshipped by billions, while the Primarchs and their legions were forgotten, their sacrifices erased from history. He was shown images that suggested the Emperor had always intended to use his sons as tools, to be discarded when they were no longer useful, just as the Thunder Warriors had been discarded before them. He was told that the Emperor had made a bargain with Chaos on Molech, that his power was stolen rather than earned, that the entire foundation of the Imperium was built on lies and stolen glory. Were these visions true? Some of them, partially. The Emperor had indeed made some kind of arrangement on Molech. He had indeed disposed of the Thunder Warriors. Well, he did tend to treat his sons more as instruments than as individuals, but the visions that Horus was shown twisted these partial truths into a narrative of deliberate, malicious betrayal that bore only a superficial resemblance to the complex reality. The Chaos Gods were not interested in truth. They were interested in corruption. And the weapon they used to corrupt Horus was not power or promises of glory, but the one thing that Horus valued above all else and feared losing more than death itself: his father's love. When Horus emerged from his delirium on Davin, he was changed. The corruption took hold slowly at first, a growing resentment, a sharpening suspicion, a gradual erosion of the bonds that had connected him to the Emperor and to the broader purpose of the Crusade. But as the poison spread, it began to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways. Horus began to surround himself with advisors who encouraged his doubts and his resentment. He opened channels of communication with Primarchs who had their own grievances against the Emperor, brothers who felt neglected, betrayed, or constrained by the Imperium's rules and hierarchies. And one by one, he drew them toward rebellion. The scale of the betrayal that followed was almost incomprehensible. Fully half of the Space Marine legions turned against the Emperor. 9 Primarchs, each commanding tens of thousands of superhuman warriors, declared for Horus. Along with them came vast portions of the Imperial army, the Mechanicum and the Titan legions. All worlds that had been brought into compliance during the Great Crusade were now set ablaze, as the forces of chaos swept through Imperial space like a wildfire. The opening blow of the heresy was the Istvan system atrocity. On Istvan III, Horus ordered a virus bombing of the planet's surface, specifically targeting those members of his own forces who he knew would not join his rebellion. Loyal Space Marines of the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard were deliberately sent to the planet's surface and then bombarded from orbit with Life Eater virus, a biological weapon so potent that it reduced all organic matter on the planet to a chemical sludge within hours. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty, a massacre of his own loyal soldiers carried out with cold efficiency. But the killing on Istvan III was merely the prelude. The true horror came at Istvan V, where the traitor legions staged the drop site massacre. 3 loyalist legions, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands, were lured to Istvan V under the pretense that they would reinforce a force already fighting the traitors. Instead, the 4 additional legions that had been sent as supposed reinforcements revealed themselves as traitors, turning their weapons on the loyalist forces from behind. The result was a slaughter of staggering proportions. The Iron Hands Primarch Ferrus Manus was killed, beheaded by his own brother Fulgrim, in a duel that embodied the intimate horror of a civil war between brothers. The Salamanders and Raven Guard were decimated so severely that they would play little further role in the conflict. Across the galaxy, the heresy unfolded in a cascade of battles, betrayals, and atrocities. Worlds burned. Populations died in their billions. The great war machines of the Imperium turned upon each other with a fury that made the campaigns of the Great Crusade look restrained by comparison. And at the center of it all, the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, trapped by the necessity of maintaining the Webway seal, unable to take direct command of the forces defending his Imperium. 7 years. The Horus heresy lasted 7 years from its opening shots to its final, cataclysmic conclusion. 7 years of galaxy-spanning civil war that killed uncountable billions and left the Imperium shattered almost beyond repair. And it all led to a single moment. A single confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity for the next 10,000 years. The Siege of Terra. The final battle of the Horus heresy. The moment when everything came to a head. Horus brought his forces to Terra with the full fury of the chaos-empowered traitor legions at his back. The orbital bombardment that preceded the ground assault was some of the most intense that the galaxy had ever witnessed, and it shook even the battle-hardened defenders to their core. The Imperial Palace, the greatest fortress ever built by human hands, was besieged by an army of superhuman warriors, backed by demonic entities and the corrupted war machines of the Dark Mechanicum. The defense was led by Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists and the greatest fortress builder in the Imperium, along with the Blood Angels under Sanguinius and the White Scars under the Khan. The Custodian Guard defended the innermost walls. The Sisters of Silence, whose innate anti-psychic abilities made them uniquely effective against demonic entities, fought in the most dangerous sectors. And billions of ordinary human soldiers, Imperial army troopers and conscripted civilians held the outer fortifications with nothing but their courage and their faith in the Emperor. The siege lasted for weeks, months. The fighting was beyond anything that words can adequately describe. The walls of the Imperial Palace, miles high and reinforced by technologies that defied understanding, were breached in a dozen places by the relentless assault. Traitor titans, corrupted engines of destruction that stood hundreds of feet tall, stalked through the ruins of the palace's outer districts. Demons manifested in waves as the barrier between the material world and the warp grew thin from the sheer volume of death and suffering being generated. And throughout it all, the Emperor remained on the Golden Throne, fighting his own war in the immaterial realm, maintaining the seal on the Webway portal, battling the demonic entities that sought to breach the palace's defenses from within. He could not leave. He could not fight. He could only sit and endure and pour his immeasurable psychic power into holding the line against a darkness that grew stronger with every hour the siege continued. Then the moment came. The shields of Horus's flagship, the vengeful spirit, were lowered. Whether this was a deliberate act, a trap designed to lure the Emperor into a confrontation, or a moment of overconfidence on Horus's part, the result was the same. The Emperor sensed the opening, and he knew that the time had come. He could not sit on the Golden Throne any longer. The siege was being lost. Terra would fall unless Horus was stopped, and only the Emperor had the power to stop him. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's oldest and most trusted advisor, took his place on the Golden Throne. Malcador was a powerful psyker, the second strongest human in existence, but he was not the Emperor. The strain of maintaining the Webway seal and the other functions of the throne was killing him from the moment he sat down. Every second that passed burned away more of his life force, reducing the ancient Sigillite to a husk. He endured it because the Emperor asked it of him, and because there was no other way. The Emperor teleported aboard the vengeful spirit with a hand-picked force of custodians and space marines. Rogel Dawn accompanied him. Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, insisted on coming as well. despite the emperor's wish that he stay behind. Sanguinius had foreseen his own death at Horus's hands and was determined to face it rather than flee from it. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The beautiful winged Primarch faced his corrupted brother in a duel that was as inevitable as it was tragic. Sanguinius was one of the greatest warriors among the Primarchs, a being of almost supernatural grace and combat skill. But Horus, empowered by the combined might of all four Chaos gods, was beyond anything that any single Primarch could match. Sanguinius fought with everything he had, and in the end, Horus killed him. The Angel of the Blood Angels died on the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, his beautiful wings broken, his body shattered by the War Master's terrible power. When the Emperor found Horus, standing over the broken body of Sanguinius, the stage was set for the most important duel in the history of the galaxy. Father against son, creator against creation, the embodiment of humanity's hope against the avatar of its potential destruction. They fought, and it was not the clean, heroic clash that Imperial propaganda would later portray. It was brutal, desperate, and devastating. The Emperor, already weakened by years of maintaining the Golden Throne and the Webway Seal, was further handicapped by something that the coldest analyses of his character might not predict. He hesitated, whether out of love for the son he had raised, or pragmatic hope that some trace of the original Horus might still be recoverable, or simply the inability to accept the magnitude of his own failure, the Emperor held back. He did not fight with full commitment. He pulled his blows. He held on to the possibility of redemption long after any realistic chance of it had passed, and Horus made him pay for it. The War Master burned the Emperor's face. He burst his eye. He ripped his arm from its socket. He broke his spine across his knee. The most powerful human being who had ever lived was beaten, broken, reduced to a shattered wreck by a creature that had once been his greatest triumph and was now his most terrible failure. The exact details of how the fight ended vary between sources, as is often the case with 40k lore, but the essential elements are consistent. Here something happened that finally forced the Emperor to abandon his restraint and unleash the full, devastating force of his psychic power against his son. In some accounts, it was the death of a single, ordinary human being, a lone Imperial soldier who stood against Horus despite having no chance of survival and was slaughtered for his courage. In other accounts, it was the sight of Sanguinius's broken body, or a final moment of clarity in which the Emperor accepted that the Horus he had loved was gone, and that what stood before him was nothing but a puppet of the dark gods. Whatever the catalyst, the Emperor finally struck with everything he had. He gathered his psychic power, every last ounce of it, and unleashed it against Horus in a blast of pure, annihilating force that obliterated the War Master's soul entirely, not just killing him, but erasing him from existence so completely that even the Chaos gods, who could normally preserve the souls of their champions, could not reclaim him. Horus was gone, destroyed utterly. The vessel that had once contained the most beloved of the Emperor's sons was now nothing but cooling meat and empty armor. But the cost was staggering. The Emperor was broken. His body was a ruin, missing limbs and organs, burned and shattered beyond any possibility of conventional healing. Even his perpetual regeneration, the ability that had sustained him across millennia, seemed unable to cope with the catastrophic damage he had sustained. Some have speculated that the Golden Throne itself is what prevents his perpetual nature from doing its work, keeping him alive in a state that is too damaged for consciousness but too sustained for the death and rebirth that his immortal nature might otherwise allow. Rogel Dawn found the Emperor on the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, alongside the body of Sanguinius. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists carried his father's broken form back to Terra, following the Emperor's whispered final instructions. Those instructions were simple and terrible. Place him on the Golden Throne, modify it to sustain his ruined body, let him continue his work from the prison of his own broken flesh. And so it was done. The Golden Throne, originally built as a gateway to the Webway, and a tool for humanity's ascension, was hastily modified by the tech priests of the Mechanicum into a life support system of incomprehensible complexity. The Emperor was placed upon it. His desiccated body sustained by stasis fields and psi-fusion reactors and technologies so advanced that even the artificers who installed them did not fully understand how they worked. The webway portal that the throne had originally been designed to open was sealed, but the Emperor's psychic power was still needed to keep it closed. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that made warp travel possible, still required his guiding will. The wards against demonic incursion that protected Terra and the wider Imperium still depended on his consciousness in the warp. Before the silence took him, the Emperor spoke his last words. Different sources record these words differently, but the essential message was the same. The fight was not over. The darkness had not won. The Imperium must endure. His sons must continue the work. They must be vigilant. They must be faithful. They must be strong. The universe had many horrors yet to throw at them, and this was not the end of the struggle. It was just the beginning. And then the Emperor fell silent. A silence that has lasted for 10,000 years. The Golden Throne has not been kind to the Master of Mankind. For 10 millennia, his body has sat upon that ancient device, slowly decaying despite the advanced stasis fields and life support mechanisms that surround it. He is, by any physical measure, a corpse, a desiccated husk of bone and leathery skin stretched over a frame that was once the most magnificent physical form in human history. His limbs, or what remains of them, are fused to the throne's machinery. His face is a skull barely covered by a thin layer of parchment-like skin. His eyes, if they can still be called eyes, stare sightlessly into the eternal darkness of the Sanctum Imperialis, the vast throne room at the heart of the imperial palace. Almost 4 miles long and half a mile high, the throne room is a space of such awe-inspiring scale that it defies comprehension. Mountains of churning apparatus surround the throne, their purpose understood by fewer and fewer of the tech priests who maintain them, with each passing century. Heavy alchemical fog shrouds the Emperor's form. Eldritch power halos around the machinery in patterns that suggest both supreme technological achievement and something far more primal and mystical. The Adeptus Custodes, the golden armored guardians who have protected the Emperor since before the Imperium existed, maintain their silent vigil. Few living mortals have ever been granted the privilege of entering this chamber and standing in the Emperor's direct presence. But if the Emperor's body is a ruin, his mind remains active, terrifyingly, incomprehensibly active. Across the warp, the Emperor's consciousness maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows Imperial ships to navigate the nightmare dimension of warp space. Without this beacon, warp travel would become far more hazardous than it already is, and the million worlds of the Imperium would effectively be cut off from each other, isolated islands in a sea of darkness, just as they were during the Age of Strife. The Emperor's will sustains the beacon, but the raw psychic energy needed to power it comes from a more disturbing source. 1,000 psychers are sacrificed every single day, as their life forces drained and fed to the Emperor to maintain his strength. They are called the Chosen, selected from among the ranks of the Adeptus Astronomica, and they give their lives willingly, for they understand that without their sacrifice, the entire Imperium would cease to exist. The Emperor also continues to fight. In the warp, his consciousness battles the Chaos Gods and their demonic servants constantly, holding back the tides of corruption and destruction that would overwhelm humanity if they were allowed to flow unchecked. He maintains the seal on the ruined webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace, preventing the demons that still press against it from breaking through and flooding Terra with the horrors of the immaterial realm. He is said to guide his servants through the Emperor's Tarot, and a psychically reactive divination tool that select psychers can consult to gain a glimpse of the future and the Emperor's will. He soul binds astropaths, the psychic communicators who serve as the Imperium's only means of faster-than-light communication, granting them a measure of protection against warp predators in exchange for their physical sight. He does all of this simultaneously. He has been doing it for 10,000 years. And the strain is telling. The Golden Throne is failing. The mechanisms that sustain the Emperor's body are deteriorating, and the tech priests who maintain them possess less and less understanding of how they work with each passing generation. By the 36th millennium, the throne began to require increasing numbers of sacrifices to maintain its function. By the early 41st millennium, the demand had quadrupled. Tech priests examining the throne have discovered failures in its mechanisms that are far beyond their ability to repair. The knowledge needed to fix the Golden Throne was lost long ago, during the very upheavals that necessitated its current use. There is a dead man's switch built into the system. During the Siege of Terra, the Primarch Vulcan, on the Emperor's instructions, installed a device called the Talisman of 7 Hammers. This device is designed to activate if the Golden Throne fails entirely, and its function is as terrible as it is simple. It will destroy the entire Imperial Palace and all of Terra along with it, in an explosion of such magnitude that nothing will remain. The purpose is not preservation, the purpose is denial. If the Golden Throne fails, the webway portal will rip open, and Terra will be flooded with demons. The talisman ensures that the forces of chaos will never claim the homeworld of humanity. They will inherit nothing but ashes. This is the price of the Emperor's continued existence, a daily blood tax of 1,000 souls, a slowly failing machine that no one knows how to repair, a dead man's switch that will obliterate the cradle of human civilization, and at the center of it all, a consciousness that may or may not still be fully aware of its surroundings, trapped in a body that is barely distinguishable from a mummy, doing the work of a god because no one else can. The irony is exquisite and terrible. The Emperor, who fought against religion his entire life, who demanded that humanity abandon superstition and embrace reason, who burned churches and persecuted priests and established atheism as the official doctrine of his Imperium, has become the god of the largest religious institution in the galaxy. The imperial cult, the state religion of the Imperium, worships the Emperor as the God Emperor of mankind, the divine father and protector of the human race. Billions upon billions of humans across 1 million worlds offer daily prayers to a being who spent his active life insisting that he was not a god and that worship was a poison that fed the very enemies he was trying to destroy. And here is the most disturbing twist. The worship might actually be working. There is compelling evidence within the lore that the collective faith of billions of believers has had a tangible effect on the Emperor's power in the warp. The concept of living saints, individuals who are temporarily imbued with a fraction of the Emperor's power through the mechanism of extreme faith, suggests that worship does channel psychic energy to the Emperor. The appearance of what seems to be the Emperor's direct intervention in certain battles, saving Imperial forces from certain destruction through seemingly miraculous events, further supports this interpretation. If this is true, then the Emperor's situation is a paradox of almost unbearable complexity. The very thing he fought against, the very impulse he tried to eradicate from human culture, may now be one of the primary forces keeping him and the Imperium alive. The religion he despised may be the most effective weapon in his ongoing war against chaos. The worship he rejected may be the only thing preventing the Golden Throne from failing entirely. And what does the Emperor think about all of this? Does he think about it at all? The question of the Emperor's current mental state is one of the great unsolved mysteries of 40k lore. Some sources suggest that he is still fully conscious, still aware of everything happening in his Imperium, still making decisions and guiding his servants with the same purposeful intelligence he displayed when he walked among them. Other sources suggest that his mind has fragmented, splintered by 10 millennia of unimaginable strain into competing aspects that may not always agree or even recognize each other. Still others hint that what remains on the throne is barely consciousness at all, that the Emperor's mind has dissolved into something more akin to a force of nature than an individual intelligence, are a psychic presence that sustains the Astronomicon and holds back chaos through sheer momentum rather than deliberate will. When the Primarch Rabut Guilliman was resurrected in the 41st Millennium and granted an audience with the Emperor, what he experienced left him deeply shaken. The details of their conversation have not been fully revealed, but Guilliman emerged from the throne room a changed man, seemingly struggling with a profound spiritual crisis. The pragmatic, rational Primarch of the Ultramarines, who had always adhered to the imperial truth and rejected the idea of the Emperor's divinity, seemed for the first time to be genuinely unsure of his own beliefs. He began to wonder if, whatever the Emperor had been 10,000 years ago, he might have become something like a god in the intervening millennia, us transformed by the collective faith of trillions of worshippers into something that the imperial truth could not adequately describe. And then there are the theories about the Emperor's potential return. The oldest and most persistent of these is the Star Child theory. According to this account, most of the Emperor's soul dispersed from his body after his mortal wounding at the hands of Horus, merging into the warp, in much the same way that the souls of the ancient shamans had merged before his birth. Within the warp, this dispersed soul essence has been slowly coalescing into something new, a potential entity known as the Star Child, which represents the possibility of the Emperor's eventual rebirth. The Star Child cannot be born, however, while the Emperor remains tethered to the Golden Throne. His physical death might be the prerequisite for his spiritual resurrection. There is also the matter of the Terminus Decree, a sealed document that the Emperor himself entrusted to the Grey Knights, the most elite and secretive chapter of Space Marines. The contents of this decree are unknown to anyone except the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, who alone is permitted to break the seal and read it in the event of the most extreme possible emergency. What the decree contains is a matter of fierce speculation. Some believe it is an order to destroy the Emperor himself, should he become corrupted by chaos. Others believe it contains instructions for triggering some final mechanism of the Golden Throne, perhaps the Talisman of Seven Hammers, perhaps something else entirely. Yet the very existence of the decree tells us something important about the Emperor. Even at the height of his power, he was pragmatic enough to plan for the worst-case scenario, including the possibility of his own corruption. Recent developments in the lore have added new wrinkles to the question of the Emperor's fate. Visions of a golden infant, interspersed with flashes of a radiant being rising from a throne of light, have been reported across astropathic relay networks beginning in Segmentum Solar. These visions, which many have connected to the Star Child legend, have caused enormous upheaval within the Imperium, inspiring some to hope for the Emperor's imminent return, and others, including servants of chaos, to take urgent action to prevent it. The story remains unresolved, deliberately so, because the question of the Emperor's ultimate fate is the single greatest open question in the entire 40,000 setting. What we can say with certainty is this: the Emperor of Mankind is the most important being in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, not merely because of the power he wields or the empire he founded, but because of what he represents. He is the embodiment of humanity's highest ambitions and its most terrible failures. He is the architect of a dream that was magnificent in its conception and catastrophic in its execution. He is a being of godlike power who insisted he was not a god, a champion of reason and science who is now worshipped as a deity by the very civilization he built to be free of superstition. He is a father who created sons and then failed to love them properly, a general who won every battle but lost the war, a visionary whose vision was so vast that even he could not hold all its pieces together. The Imperium he built has become the very thing he fought against, a totalitarian theocracy consumed by fear, superstition, and endless war. The imperial truth, his beloved doctrine of secular rationalism, has been declared heresy. The religious impulse he tried to eradicate has become the foundation of his own deification. The Space Marines he created to liberate humanity now serve as the enforcers of a system that would horrify their creator. And the Chaos Gods, the enemy he devoted his entire existence to defeating, continue to feed on the suffering and fear of a galaxy that has known nothing but war for 10,000 years. And yet, the Imperium endures. Humanity survives. The Astronomicon still burns. The warp gates remain sealed. The demons are held at bay. For all its failures, for all its horrors, for all the distance between what the Emperor dreamed and what the Imperium has become, the fundamental truth of the 40k setting remains the same. Without the Emperor, there would be nothing. No Imperium, no interstellar travel, no defense against the infinite threats that press in from every direction. Every prayer whispered in every chapel, on every world across the galaxy, is addressed to a being who may or may not be able to hear it, but whose existence, such as it is the only thing standing between humanity and absolute annihilation. The Emperor protects. Whether he does so by choice or by compulsion, through conscious will or through the mechanical momentum of a mind that has been doing the same thing for 10,000 years, is a question that may never be answered. But the protection is real. The beacon still burns. The gates still hold. And somewhere, in the depths of the warp, in the shattered consciousness that was once the most brilliant mind in human history, something still fights. Something still endures. Something still refuses, with the same stubborn, unyielding determination that has characterized the Emperor since the day he stopped his uncle's heart with a thought in a Neolithic village 10,000 years before anyone had dreamed of the stars, to let humanity fall. That is the story of the Emperor of mankind. It is a story of ambition so vast that it spanned a galaxy, and failure so complete that it lasted 10,000 years. It is a story of sacrifice and betrayal, of love and coldness, or of dreams that were beautiful and actions that were terrible. It is the story of a being who may have been the greatest hero humanity has ever produced, or its greatest villain, or both at the same time, because in the grim darkness of the far future, the line between the two has never been entirely clear, and it is a story that is not yet finished. The Golden Throne is failing. The Great Rift has torn the galaxy in two. Primarchs are returning from the shadows of history. New threats emerge from every direction, and old enemies stir in the darkness between the stars. The Emperor's story, which began in a Neolithic village on the banks of a river in Anatolia, is approaching something, a climax, a resolution, an end that might also be a beginning. But that is a story for another time. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Emperor and the universe of Warhammer 40k, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the vast and endlessly fascinating depths of the 40,000 setting, and there is so much more to cover. From the individual stories of each Primarch, to the history of the Elder, from the nightmare of the Tyranid hive fleets, to the ancient menace of the Necrons, the universe of Warhammer 40,000 is a well that never runs dry. So stay tuned, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also the Emperor, and for now, at least, the Emperor protects. But before we close, there are aspects of the Emperor's story that deserve far more attention than a summary can provide. So let us return to some of the threads we have touched upon and pull them further, deeper into the rich soil of the lore where the most fascinating details grow. Let us talk about the Custodian Guard, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's companions, who have stood by his side since before the Imperium was even a concept. Because you cannot truly understand the Emperor without understanding the warriors he crafted, not as tools of mass conquest, but as reflections of himself. The Custodians were created using a different process than the Space Marines, where a Space Marine is made by implanting a series of 19 gene seed organs into an adolescent human, transforming him through surgery and indoctrination into something more than human. A Custodian is something else entirely. The transformation of a Custodian begins at the genetic level, rewriting the very foundation of their biology in a process so complex and individualized that no two custodians are exactly alike. They are not mass-produced. They are crafted one at a time with an attention to detail that approaches the artistic. Each one is taller than a space marine, faster, stronger, more intelligent. Each one is a warrior without peer, capable of feats that would be considered impossible even by the superhuman standards of the Adeptus Astartes. But the most important distinction between the custodians and the space marines is not physical. It is philosophical. The space marines were designed to be soldiers, to follow orders, to fight in formation, to serve as the rank and file of the Emperor's armies. The custodians were designed to be companions. They were created to stand beside the Emperor, to guard him, to advise him, to serve as the one group of beings in the entire galaxy whose loyalty was absolute and unconditional. Where a space marine's loyalty flows first to his Primarch and then to the Emperor, a custodian's loyalty is to the Emperor alone. It is hardwired into the fundamental architecture of their being, a devotion so total that the very concept of betrayal is alien to their psychology. Constantin Valdor was the first of them, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, a warrior whose name has echoed across 10,000 years of imperial history. Valdor stood beside the Emperor during the Unification Wars, fought at his side throughout the Great Crusade, and was present during the darkest hours of the heresy. He was, by some accounts, more perfectly realized than even the Primarchs, a being who approached the Emperor's own perfection without the fatal flaws that plagued the Emperor's genesons. After the heresy, Valdor vanished, disappearing from imperial records with the same mysterious silence that characterized so many events in the early days of the post-heresy Imperium. Rumors persist that he may still be alive somewhere, operating in the shadows, carrying out some final mission entrusted to him by the Emperor himself. The custodians have maintained their vigil for 10,000 years. They guard the Emperor's body on the Golden Throne. They patrol the Imperial Palace, that continent-spanning fortress that has become their domain and their prison. For most of those 10 millennia, the custodians rarely ventured beyond the walls of the palace, as considering their sacred duty to be the protection of the Emperor's physical form above all else. But in recent centuries, as the threats to the Imperium have multiplied and the situation has grown increasingly desperate, the custodians have begun to take a more active role in the defense of humanity. They have launched military campaigns beyond terror, carrying the Emperor's wrath to the enemies of mankind with a fury and a precision that has reminded the galaxy of what these golden warriors are truly capable of. Let us also talk about the nature of the Emperor's psychic power, because it is through this power that he maintains his hold on the galaxy, even in his current shattered state. And understanding its nature is essential to understanding his significance. But the Emperor is described as the most powerful human psyker to have ever existed. This is not merely a superlative. It is a statement of fact that carries implications stretching far beyond what the simple words might suggest. Human psykers are ranked on a scale that attempts to measure the strength and scope of their abilities, from the lowest levels of barely perceptible sensitivity to the highest reaches of reality-altering power. The vast majority of human psykers fall somewhere in the lower to middle ranges of this scale. Even the most powerful sanctioned psykers in the Imperium, beings capable of leveling buildings or reading minds across vast distances, occupy a relatively modest position on the overall scale of psychic potential. The Emperor is not on that scale. He transcends it entirely. His psychic abilities are of a kind and magnitude that place him in a category occupied by no other human being and only a handful of other entities in the entire galaxy. He can project his consciousness across the breadth of the Milky Way. He can read and manipulate minds with effortless precision. He can obliterate armies with a thought. He can see the future, though his visions are always fragmentary and subject to change based on the actions of free-willed beings. He can communicate telepathically across interstellar distances. He can create and maintain psychic constructs of immense complexity such as the Astronomicon and the Webway Seal, simultaneously, while also engaging in ongoing psychic warfare against the Chaos Gods in the Warp. And here is what makes this truly staggering, as he has been doing this for 10,000 years, without rest, without relief, without a single moment of true respite. The psychic strain of maintaining the Astronomicon alone would destroy any other human psyche in a matter of hours. The Emperor has sustained it for 100 centuries, while simultaneously performing a dozen other tasks of comparable difficulty. The sheer, mind-boggling scale of his endurance is perhaps the most impressive thing about him, more impressive even than his power, because power without endurance is merely a weapon. What the Emperor has demonstrated is something closer to an eternal siege, a will so indomitable that it has held back the darkness of the galaxy for longer than most civilizations have existed. But power, even transcendent power, has limits, and those limits are being tested as never before. The opening of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium, a massive tear in the fabric of reality that split the galaxy in two, represented perhaps the greatest crisis the Imperium has faced since the Horus heresy itself. The rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, stretches from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the far reaches of the galactic east, bisecting the Imperium and cutting off half its worlds from the light of the Astronomicon. Worlds that had been protected by the Emperor's psychic presence for 10,000 years suddenly found themselves plunged into darkness, isolated and vulnerable to the predatory forces that had always lurked at the edges of Imperial space. The Astronomicon itself went dark for a period. The days of blindness, as this period came to be known, varied wildly in duration from world to world due to the temporal distortions caused by the rift. On some worlds, the blindness lasted only days. On others, it persisted for months. On Terra itself, the light went out for 33 days, a period of terror and desperation, unlike anything the homeworld of humanity had experienced since the Siege of Terra 10,000 years earlier. When the Astronomicon reignited, many interpreted it as a sign of the Emperor's continued strength. But others saw it as evidence of something more alarming, that the Emperor was straining harder than ever before, that the effort required to maintain the beacon was consuming ever more of his already diminished reserves. The increased demand for psycho-sacrifices, the deterioration of the Golden Throne's mechanisms, the growing frequency and severity of demonic incursions, all of these pointed toward a trajectory that could only end in one way if nothing changed. The return of Reboot Guilliman provided a temporary reprieve. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected through a combination of Eldar technology and the intervention of the Tech Magos Belisarius Cawl, launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign designed to push back the forces of chaos and stabilize the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift's opening. Guilliman also introduced the Primaris Space Marines, a new breed of superhuman warrior created using technology that Cawl had been secretly developing for 10,000 years, whose enhanced gene seed and improved physiology made them superior to their predecessors in virtually every measurable way. Guilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade have bought the Imperium time, but how much time is unclear. The Great Rift continues to pour demons and corruption into the material universe. The Golden Throne continues to deteriorate. And the Emperor's condition, whatever it truly is, shows no signs of improving. Let us consider one more dimension of the Emperor's story that we have not yet fully explored: the moral dimension. Because the Emperor is not merely a figure of strategic and military importance, he is a figure of profound moral complexity, and the questions his existence raises about the nature of power, sacrifice, and the greater good are among the most compelling in all of science fiction. Was the Emperor right? Was his vision for humanity correct? Were the sacrifices he demanded justified by the outcomes they achieved? But these are not questions that admit of easy answers. The Emperor's defenders point to the sheer scale of the threat he was trying to protect humanity from. The Chaos Gods are real. They are actively hostile to all forms of order and stability. If the Emperor had not unified humanity and established the defenses that have kept the species alive for 10,000 years, humanity would almost certainly have been destroyed or corrupted beyond recognition during the Age of Strife or the events that followed it. The Imperium, for all its horrors, is preferable to the alternative, which is not merely death, but something far worse: the eternal damnation of the human species at the hands of entities that feed on suffering and despair. But the Emperor's critics, and they exist within the lore as well as among fans, point to the catastrophic consequences of his methods. The destruction of the Thunder Warriors was a betrayal of beings who had fought and died for his vision. The Primarch Project, for all its brilliance, created beings who were fundamentally unstable, and the Emperor's failure to properly manage his relationship with his sons was a primary cause of the heresy that destroyed everything he had built. The imperial truth, while strategically sound in theory, failed to account for the basic human need for meaning and purpose that religion provides. The enforced atheism of the Crusade era left a spiritual vacuum that was eventually filled by the very thing the Emperor had been trying to prevent: religious worship of himself. And the Imperium he left behind has become a nightmare. A galaxy-spanning empire built on slavery, oppression, genocide, and the systematic denial of individual rights and freedoms. The Inquisition, which serves as the Imperium's secret police, routinely exterminates entire planetary populations on the mere suspicion of chaos corruption. The ecclesiarchy enforces religious conformity through violence and intimidation. The vast bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra governs the Imperium with a combination of incompetence and cruelty that would be darkly comic if the suffering it caused were not so vast. Every horror of the modern Imperium can be traced back to decisions the Emperor made or failed to make, and the question of whether a better outcome was possible, whether different choices might have led to a galaxy where humanity was both safe and free, is one that the lore deliberately refuses to answer. And this moral ambiguity is what makes the Emperor such a compelling character. He is not a simple hero or a simple villain. He is both, simultaneously, in different measures, depending on which aspects of his actions you choose to emphasize. He is a being of genuinely noble intentions, who was willing to commit genuinely terrible acts in pursuit of those intentions. He is a father who loved the idea of his sons more than he loved the sons themselves. He is a champion of humanity who treated individual humans as expendable resources. He is a dreamer whose dream was beautiful and whose methods were monstrous. And he is, above all, a tragic figure. Because the tragedy of the Emperor is not merely that his plans failed, it is that his plans could never have succeeded. The Primarchs, for all their magnificence, were always destined to be flawed. And because they were created from a combination of material science and warp energy, and the warp is chaos incarnate. The Great Crusade was always going to generate resentment and resistance, because forced unification always does, no matter how noble the stated goals. The imperial truth was always going to fail, because you cannot eradicate the religious impulse from a species that has evolved to seek meaning in suffering. And the Webway project was always going to be vulnerable, because any plan that requires perfection from imperfect beings is a plan built on a foundation of sand. The Emperor knew this. On some level, he must have known. He was a being of transcendent intelligence and foresight who had spent tens of thousands of years studying the nature of humanity and the forces that shaped it. He could see the future, at least in fragments. He understood the nature of chaos better than anyone who had ever lived, and yet he pressed forward with his plan anyway, because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing meant extinction. This is the heart of the Emperor's story. Not the battles or the betrayals or the cosmic confrontations, but the fundamental question of what a being of near infinite power and wisdom does when faced with an impossible situation. The Emperor's answer was to try everything, sacrifice everything, endure everything, in the hope that some fragment of his vision might survive the inevitable disasters. And some fragment has survived. The Imperium, for all its flaws, still stands. Humanity, for all its suffering, still exists. The Astronomicon still burns. The gates still hold. Whether that is enough. But whether the Emperor's sacrifice has been worth the price that humanity continues to pay for it, is a question that every fan of Warhammer 40,000 must answer for themselves. And perhaps that is the final genius of the Emperor as a character. He is a mirror. What you see when you look at him depends entirely on what you bring to the viewing. You can see a hero or a monster, a savior or a tyrant, a father or a failure. You can see all of these things at once, because the Emperor is all of these things at once. He is the most important being in Warhammer 40k, because he is the being around whom every other story revolves. The fixed point in a universe of constant war and change, the dying light that illuminates everything else by its fading glow. 10,000 years he has sat upon that throne. 10,000 years of silent, screaming endurance. 10,000 years of holding back the darkness with nothing but the sheer, terrifying force of a will that refuses, absolutely refuses, to surrender. 10,000 years during which the galaxy has changed beyond recognition around him, while he remains the same, the eternal constant, the undying beacon, the God who is not a god, but might as well be one for all the difference the distinction makes. There is something almost beautiful about it, if you can look past the horror. The most powerful human being who ever lived, reduced to a mummified husk on a golden chair, and still fighting, still enduring, still protecting. Not because he has to, not because anyone is forcing him, but because, after everything that has happened, after every betrayal and every failure and every unforeseen disaster, and after watching his dream crumble into the nightmare of the 41st millennium, he still believes it is worth fighting for. He still believes that humanity is worth saving, and he still refuses to let go. That is the Emperor of mankind. That is the being who sits at the center of the Warhammer 40,000 universe and holds it together through the sheer force of his indomitable will. He is not perfect. He is not purely good. He is not the savior that his worshippers believe him to be, nor the monster that his enemies claim. He is something far more interesting, more complex, more human than any of those simple categories can contain. He is the most important being in Warhammer 40k, and his story is the story of everything. Now, let us talk about something that does not receive enough attention in most discussions of the Emperor. The relationship between the Emperor and the Mechanicum of Mars, because this alliance is one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of the setting, and it reveals dimensions of the Emperor's character that purely military analyses tend to overlook. Mars, by the time the Emperor turned his attention to it after the unification of Terra, was not merely another world to be conquered. It was a civilization unto itself, a techno-theocracy that had survived the age of strife more or less intact, ruled by the cult Mechanicus, a religious order that worshipped knowledge and technology as sacred and venerated a deity they called the Omnissiah, the machine god. The tech priests of Mars controlled the most advanced manufacturing capability in the entire Sol system. Their forges could produce weapons, ships, and machines of a sophistication that far exceeded anything available on Terra. Without Mars, the Emperor's plans for a great crusade across the galaxy would have been little more than a fantasy. He needed their factories, their knowledge, and their industrial capacity. But the Mechanicum was not going to simply submit to imperial authority. They had their own culture, their own religion, their own understanding of themselves and their place in the universe. And that understanding was fundamentally incompatible with the imperial truth. The Emperor demanded atheism. The Mechanicum demanded the freedom to worship the machine god. These two positions should have been irreconcilable. What the Emperor did next was one of the most politically astute maneuvers of his entire career. Yet he presented himself to the Mechanicum not as a conqueror or a ruler, but as the Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of the machine god that they had been worshipping for millennia. Whether the emperor actually believed this, whether he was the omnissiah in any meaningful sense, or whether this was simply a calculated lie designed to win the Mechanicum's loyalty, is one of the great unanswered questions of the lore. What matters is that the Mechanicum accepted it. They recognized the emperor as the omnissiah and pledged their allegiance to his Imperium, bringing with them the manufacturing capability that would make the Great Crusade possible. In exchange, the emperor granted the Mechanicum a remarkable degree of autonomy. They were allowed to maintain their own religion, their own internal governance, and their own cultural traditions, even as the rest of the Imperium was being subjected to the enforced atheism of the imperial truth. This was a compromise, and the emperor was not typically a being given to compromise. But he was pragmatic above all else, and the pragmatic calculation was clear. The Imperium needed Mars more than Mars needed the Imperium, at least in the short term. Forcing the Mechanicum to abandon their faith would have started a war that the emperor could not afford to fight when the galaxy awaited his conquest. This alliance, the Treaty of Mars, or the Treaty of Olympus Mons as it was sometimes called, was one of the foundational agreements of the Imperium. And like so many of the emperor's arrangements, it carried within it the seeds of future problems. Yet the Mechanicum's religious beliefs were fundamentally at odds with the secular rationalism of the imperial truth, and this contradiction created a fault line running through the heart of the Imperium that would be exploited by the forces of chaos during the heresy. A significant portion of the Mechanicum would eventually betray the emperor, forming the Dark Mechanicum that served the traitor legions with weapons and war machines of terrible corrupted power. But the alliance also produced extraordinary benefits. The combined industrial and scientific resources of Terra and Mars fueled the Great Crusade and sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. The Titan legions, those god machines that bestrode the battlefields of the Great Crusade and the heresy like walking cathedrals of destruction, were products of Martian engineering. The ships of the Imperial Navy, the weapons of the Space Marine legions, the vast infrastructure of the Imperium's logistical network, all of it depended on the Mechanicum's expertise and manufacturing capability. And in a twist that speaks to the Emperor's long-term strategic thinking, the alliance with Mars also served a more subtle purpose. On Mars, deep beneath the surface of the planet, the Emperor had imprisoned something ancient and powerful and terrifyingly alien. One of the godlike energy beings known as the Satan, specifically the entity known as the Void Dragon. According to fragmentary and disputed accounts, the Emperor had fought and defeated the Void Dragon long before the Unification Wars, in an epic confrontation that some have connected to the legend of St. George and the Dragon. He had imprisoned the defeated Satan beneath the surface of Mars, and its presence, its influence, its unconscious psychic emanations had been the inspiration for the cult Mechanicus itself. The machine god that the tech priests worshipped was, unknowing to them, a captive alien deity that the Emperor had placed beneath their feet as part of a plan so long-ranging that it defied comprehension. If this is true, and the evidence is suggestive, if not conclusive, then the Emperor's relationship with Mars was not merely a political alliance. It was a masterstroke of manipulation that used a captive alien god as the bait to secure the loyalty of the one civilization whose resources he absolutely needed to achieve his goals. The tech priests worshipped the echo of a caged god, and the Emperor presented himself as the avatar of that same god, creating a chain of belief and loyalty that stretched from the deepest dungeons of Mars to the highest reaches of the Imperial war machine. This is what makes the Emperor simultaneously admirable and unsettling. His plans operated on timescales that spanned millennia and involved layers of manipulation and foresight that bordered on the incomprehensible. He was playing chess in 1,000 dimensions simultaneously, moving pieces that did not even know they were being moved, toward outcomes that only he could envision. And he did it all in service of a goal that was, at its core, noble: the survival and advancement of the human species. But the methods he employed to pursue that goal were so cold, so calculated, so utterly devoid of concern for the feelings and autonomy of the individuals involved, that even his most devoted followers sometimes struggled to reconcile the grandeur of his vision with the ruthlessness of his execution. And that brings us back to the central question that has echoed throughout this entire exploration. Was the emperor good? The answer, like everything else about the emperor, is complicated. He was good in the sense that his ultimate goal, the survival and elevation of humanity, was good. He was good in the sense that without his actions, humanity would almost certainly no longer exist. He was good in the sense that he sacrificed more than any being in history has ever sacrificed, enduring 10,000 years of living death to protect a species that worships him as a god, despite his lifelong insistence that he was merely a man. But he was also, by any conventional moral standard, monstrous. He slaughtered the Thunder Warriors. He failed his sons. He imposed his will on the galaxy through force and manipulation. He denied billions of humans the comfort of religious belief in the name of a strategic objective they could not understand and did not choose. He kept secrets that, had they been shared, might have prevented the heresy entirely. And the Imperium he built has become a nightmarish dystopia that represents everything he claimed to be fighting against. The truth, as it so often does in the 40,000 universe, resists simple categorization. The Emperor was a being of extraordinary complexity, operating in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. He made choices that were terrible, and those choices had consequences that were even more terrible. But the alternative choices, the paths not taken, might well have led to outcomes that were worse still. We will never know, because those paths were never walked. We have only the path that was chosen, the path that led from a Neolithic village in Anatolia to the Golden Throne beneath the Imperial Palace, and the Emperor who walks it still, in whatever diminished, fragmented, agonized form he now inhabits. Let us leave him there, on his throne, in his silence, in his endless war. Let us leave him doing what he has always done, what he will continue to do until the Golden Throne finally fails, or something changes in a way that no one can predict. Let us leave him fighting, because in the grim darkness of the far future, that is what the Emperor does. He fights, not with swords or bolters or the weapons of war that he once wielded with such devastating skill, but with something far more powerful, his will, the sheer, implacable, absolutely unyielding force of a consciousness that has decided, across 10,000 years of suffering that would break any lesser being into dust, that humanity is worth saving, that the dream, even shattered, even corrupted, even twisted into something he would barely recognize, is still worth holding on to. And maybe that is enough. Maybe in the end, the Emperor's greatest gift to humanity was not the Imperium, not the Space Marines, not the Astronomicon or the Golden Throne, or any of the grand physical achievements that bear his name. Maybe his greatest gift was simply the example, the demonstration that even in the darkest possible circumstances, even when everything has gone wrong and every plan has failed and every hope has been betrayed, it is still possible to fight, still possible to endure, still possible to refuse, with every fiber of your being, to surrender. That is the Emperor. That is his legacy. And that is why, across 1,000,000 worlds and in 1,000,000,000 hearts, 3 words continue to echo with a power that transcends language, culture, and even belief itself. The Emperor protects. And now, if you made it this far, I want to personally thank you for spending this time with me. This channel is built on the love of this universe and the incredible stories that live within it. If you enjoyed this deep dive, I would truly appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Q on 40,000. Every subscription, every like, every comment helps this channel grow and allows me to keep creating content like this for you. I have so much more planned, so many more corners of this vast universe to explore together. Drop a comment below and let me know what topic you would like me to cover next. Until then, take care of yourselves, be kind to one another, and remember that even in the darkest moments, the light endures. The Emperor protects, always.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.